Diogwich, Strasvitia. Greetings from Galway on the west coast of Ireland. And this is about the only thing Russian that I can find in my hometown. These are Russian cannons that were taken as trophies at the end of the Crimean War in the 1850s. And Ireland at the time was part of the British Empire. It was actually part of the metropole. It was part of the United Kingdom and of Great Britain and Ireland. And Crimea was basically an imperial clash, shall we say. There was the Russian Empire against mainly an alliance of different empires. So you had the British Empire there as one of the belligerents in the war. And at the end of the war, they took many Russian armaments and they put them in cities and towns across the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. I actually have family history to do with this war. One of my ancestors actually died in this war in Crimea, in the British and Irish, obviously, troops who went there. He was killed in a very famous battle called the Battle of Balaclava, in the charge of the Light Brigade, in fact. It's immortalized in poetry in the English language as an enormous military disaster, in fact. So I have my own family history here. Why is all this important? Because today we're going to react to a Russian YouTuber who has a pretty significant channel in English promoting Russia, Ellie from Russia. And she, in one of her videos, goes to Victory Day, May 9th in Russia. And obviously we have the backdrop to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So it is day 98 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm making this video for your reference about the information I have at hand at this point. And the really important point is, and the purpose of making this video is, what is going to be the future in Russia? Is it going to continue to be an empire, effectively an empire, an unreformed empire, or is it going to change its foreign policy and maybe its own political system to stop being a threat to its neighbors? Or do we go back to these days where all countries are engaged in empire? Anyways, let's get into the video. Bye, Kelly.
Tsar Experience.
So 2020 was supposed to be the year of Russia on my YouTube channel, but then again, we had COVID, so I never ended up going. And then I was super excited originally to make 2022 the year of Russia on my YouTube channel, and then on February 24th, I decided to have a full-scale invasion of Ukraine where I was. I had to leave Ukraine for obvious reasons, and yeah, I'm not planning currently to go to Russia to promote it. But when I was doing my research for going to Russia, I came across a channel called Ellie from Russia. Now, Elena is a Russian girl who does the kind of, I guess, kind of similar videos in some ways to what I've been doing in Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. Some street interviews, vlogs as she travels around, and there's a lot of, say, contemporary culture kind of topics, not so political, and yeah, then we have this war. So some of her more recent videos have been more of that nature, even if they're from the cultural point of view. She also, prior to the war, she had two very kind of odd videos, out of place, I would say, on her channel. She had a video which was a day with Spetsnaz. Spetsnaz is the Russian Special Forces at a time when, you know, we had a lot of, well, what people at the time were calling Western hysteria about Russia, about planning to invade Ukraine, which is when they were placing their troops on Ukraine's borders, and Putin was telling everybody, I'm not going to invade, those troops are just kind of resting there, doing some exercise. Of course, he was lying about it at the time, but she did this video that didn't really make much sense on a Russian culture channel, unless you're trying to say that Russia is a militaristic country. Well, maybe fair enough from that point of view. But anyways, that video has disappeared off her channel since February 24th. And she also did an interview with a guy, an American who moved to Russia, whose content on YouTube is pretty aggressively Russian nationalist, shall we say. So these were two things that were a bit strange, I thought. But that being said, when the invasion happened, she started to make videos about the situation in Russia, which is understandable, sanctions, the impact. Although I would say that she seemed to moan a bit and express a lot of, I guess, sentiments a little bit similar to the video I did about Roman. That, oh, what's this going to mean for me? Will I be able to get paid? Will I be able to go on YouTube? you know, of course, with the laws in Russia that she cites, she's not allowed to discuss it. She keeps calling it special military operation, the normal blah, blah, blah. Not allowed to call it a war, zero criticism of the government. Also not very emotionally invested in like what could be going on in Ukraine, it seemed. And then she did a video on May 9th, which is Victory Day. And it's celebrated in a lot of countries in the former Soviet Union. It's the victory over Nazi Germany in the Great Patriotic War. And it's important to note that it's the Great Patriotic War, which is 1941 to 1945. If you ever see a Soviet war memorial, it doesn't say 1939 to 1945, which would be what we would define normally in the West as the Second World War, because from 1939 to 1941, the Soviet Union was in an alliance, in effect, well, they had signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany itself. So they were on the same side and they were collaborating, shall we say, with Nazi Germany. And this is relevant to something we're going to get into in the video in a few minutes when I play a clip from Ellie from Russia. And now, also in Ukraine, it's become maybe a bit more controversial to celebrate it, but celebrated it was this year. And of course, with the invasion of Ukraine and Putin trying to make all these connections between the victory over Nazi Germany with the current Ukrainian government by saying he's doing a process of denazification, which is just basically him defining whoever he doesn't like as a Nazi, and we got to have another glorious victory like in 1945. You can see the connection, how uncomfortable it sits. But I think there's a bigger issue to do with, I think, in general in Russia, and I think this is why it seems that the support for the war has been so high so far. We don't really know. Of course, it's hard to get accurate polls, but it seems like opposition is probably only about 25%, any strong opposition, at least, you know, what we can see from the polls have been taken by the Levada Center. And yeah, just from speaking to my friends who are either in Russia or have left Russia, they really think it's probably about that. And how Putin tapped into the Russians' feeling of grievance. And that grievance comes from feeling that they're entitled to be, I think, entitled to be in an imperial power still. Putin in the previous year to the invasion had often talked about 19th century history and, you know, said, well, the U.S. annexed part of Mexico in whatever it would have been, 1850s. So yeah, no one talks about it anymore. Yeah, because that was the 19th century. We changed things after the Second World War legally. You're not supposed to be able to do that anymore. So yeah, that's why we still talk about, say, Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 and why it's a de facto annexation and not a de jure annexation, right? So it's not legal under international law, it's illegal. And the real litmus test to that is actually the fact that, well, very few countries in the world recognize it. So basically, if you had like over 50% of the countries recognizing, then maybe we would say it was legal. But not when you have, I think it's about 10% of the UN members saying so. And none of the major ones except for Russia itself. The big issue is, and I think this is often to do with people who maybe don't travel so much in Russia, at least that's my perception of it, is that they don't really understand, you know, maybe what the Soviet Union did to other countries while they were winning and after they're winning in, say, Central Europe and maybe even other parts of the Soviet Union, like the Baltics, like Ukraine, like Belarus, and obviously Central Europe, I mean places like Hungary, Poland, either when they were allied with the Nazis between 1939 and 1941 and after the war, and that not everybody celebrates it. And they don't celebrate because they're Nazis. It's like the Soviet Union was a totalitarian state that killed millions of people. And all those people were Soviet citizens. So there isn't really a great sense, I think, of reflection about what happened. And I understand, obviously, that the Nazis were genocidal maniacs and they planned and committed genocide on the territory of the Soviet Union. And they planned to kill a lot more people if they could have. So I understand the existential fight that there was from the Soviet Union during the Second World War. But at the same time, their own regime was genocidal. And they did that, for example, in Ukraine with the Holodomor. And actually, after the Second World War ended, in parts of Western Ukraine, when I was in Chernovtsi just before, well, that's where I had to flee from on February 25th, the memorial there is actually to the victims of the Holodomor in 1946. and that's after the Second World War. It's after the original collectivization in the 30s. The Holodomor was a man-made famine, basically by Stalin, to simplify it, which particularly targeted Ukrainians. It also affected other parts of the Soviet Union, and millions of people died in it. And it was repeated after the Second World War because there were parts of the Soviet Union that they annexed parts of other countries like Poland, for example, or Romania, and those parts hadn't been collectivized. So collectivization was when they basically took the land off the farmers. Here I'm sitting in the countryside on the west coast of Ireland, and yeah, all the traditionally here there would be small holdings, farmers, and basically they said, hey, you're not allowed, till your own land and have your own animals. They've all got to be put together for the benefit of the country, and they collectivized, they centralized the farms, and that met with a lot of resistance because the farmers who were productive were like, hey, what do you mean we have to put it all together and you take all my stuff, basically, and I'm the highly productive farmer. So that met with resistance, and the way that Stalin dealt with that was basically to starve them to death. And they did it again after the war. So it wasn't an accident. They did it on purpose. If you redo something that kills millions of people, well, probably you're planning to do it, and it's intentional. So there isn't that sense of reflection, and I think it's maybe hard for people in small towns that don't travel. But Ellie from Russia lived abroad in a few different countries. She has a channel that is in English that presents or markets basically Russia to foreigners. So you would expect that she has maybe reflected a bit more on things. So let's see, she goes to a small town on the 9th of May.
Many of you asked me if it's possible for foreigners to come to Russia now. I guess yes. My friend from Italy came recently. Look what I found. Russia Today channel's kiosk, and they have a hat and a t-shirt saying foreign agent, and a mask which says freedom of speech with Cyrillic letters.
I don't know whether to interpret that as a plug for RT, which is Russia Today, which is state TV in Russia, or it's actually just pointing out the irony of it in a country where freedom of speech is obviously very regulated, especially with this war, where you're not free to criticize what's happening with the war or the fact that there is a war. And then you have RT saying foreign agent. It's normally what people are labeled as if they're considered not an enemy of the state maybe, but basically they have this term foreign agent for organizations that they want to clamp down on in Russia that might be criticizing the government in general. They say that they're foreign agents, they receive money from abroad. So I don't know what to make of that. Why is that in the video? Is she being ironic? Very strange that that's in the video without any context, but maybe that's her way of saying, hey, Russia, give us back our freedom of speech.
Every single Russian has at least one family member who took part in the Great Patriotic War, who was injured there or died in this war, and more than 27 million of Russians died during this war, so it's a huge thing for us.
So there she says 23 million Russians died. Hold on a sec, Russians? It was the Soviet Union. 23 million Soviet citizens died during World War II, and that's a big, important distinction because I think about 10 million of those people were Ukrainians, and I know the population of Belarus was reduced by 1/3, so a few million Belarusians also died. Never mind the other nationalities that are in, or ethnicities that are in the Soviet Union. So there were not 23 million Russians. It's a bit odd to say 23 million Russians and not say 23 million Soviets, because you're kind of excluding the 10 million Ukrainians who died, and obviously there's a war at the moment where Russia has invaded Ukraine. So very strange for her to get this wrong, since she's obviously traveled a lot and doing this for YouTube, where you're kind of going to, it's going to be on the internet, so you tend to try and be a bit more correct about this. But that's a little bit in the Russian psyche. I think that it's Russians were killed when, let's not talk about the Ukrainians who died.
My grandfather from my dad's side also took part in the war. He is from Perm region. He studied in Perm. That time the city was named Molotov. And when he was 20, in 1940, he was drafted into the Second World War.
So there she says that her grandfather was conscripted in the army in 1940. So remember that, it's before the Great Patriotic War. At the time when he was conscripted, Soviet Union was in an alliance with Nazi Germany. And they had signed the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Ironically, Perm, she says, was called Molotov at the time. And the secret protocols to that included the Soviet Union seizing and annexing eastern Poland. So they invaded Poland along with Nazi Germany in 1939, and then afterwards in 1940 they seized the Baltic states, so Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and annexed those. And they also launched a war against Finland. It's called the Winter War. So we're not sure in 1940 exactly, was it around the time of the Winter War? So he was sent, obviously they were fighting against Finland. Kind of a bit similar, I guess, to, some of these wars are similar to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the sense that they are effectively wars of aggression, imperial wars of aggression, you could say. Like they just invaded these and then they annexed them. Or with Finland, they fought, and then the Soviet troops were subjected to huge losses, and in the end they signed a peace treaty with Finland, which Finland ceded some territory. But anyways, let's go on and see what else he did.
And he served in Murmansk region in the far north of Russia. In 1942 he became a commander of special forces on the border with Finland. In 1944 he received a medal for defending the border and defending Russia in the Arctic Circle, the far north of the country. And he survived till 9th of May 1945, so he met the Victory Day in Hungary, in Budapest.
So there we see that he fought in the north, probably against German and Finnish troops maybe. It's hard to say, she doesn't say exactly who he was fighting, which is kind of interesting to leave out. And then he celebrated Victory Day in Hungary, so then the Soviet Union basically went westwards throughout Europe, a little bit what's been happening in the last 3 months. And he celebrated in Hungary, which basically after the war obviously became a Soviet satellite state and only became really liberated from the Hungarian point of view in, I guess, the late in 1989.
But the war hasn't finished for him that day, because he continued to serve in western Ukraine, where there was a fight between the Ukrainian nationalists headed by Bandera with the Soviet guerrilla and the Red Army, where my grandfather served. So the war continued for him even after the war. And overall he was fighting there for 6 years and 6 months.
Wow, so after the Second World War ended, he then continued in the Soviet army to crush basically a rebellion by Ukrainians in the west of Ukraine for their independence. And she mentions Stepan Bandera there. Stepan Bandera is a very controversial figure. I've referred to him in other videos. I'll link that above in the card down below in the description. And basically, well, in brief, he was pretty similar to Nazis in terms of his ideological belief. There's definitely an overlap there. He's a far-right figure, like a lot of that region would have had in amongst the different nationalities, uber nationalist. And basically his forces were opportunistic. They sided with the Nazis at the beginning of the war, the Great Patriotic War. And then afterwards, the Germans didn't trust them very much. They ended up fighting against the Germans. They took part in the Holocaust, murdering a large number of Jews in Western Ukraine, and then murdering a lot of Poles, ethnic Poles, who saw them as rivals. So definitely a very unsavory character. But the reason the Soviets were fighting was not because he was a Nazi. The Soviet Union was allied with Nazi Germany from 1939 to 1941. It's because, well, he was fighting for the independence of Ukraine. You often hear Bandera mentioned in Russian propaganda today that they're fighting people, the Nazis in Ukraine, even though that's baloney. They're just simply invading Ukraine because they want to bring it back into the empire. And that's actually what her grandfather was doing. He was there ensuring that Ukraine didn't become an independent country. And if you want to know what they're doing, I mentioned the Holodomor, the mass starvation. So arguably continue on with a genocide. The second part, because in those territories in Western Ukraine that were rebelling against Soviet rule, I don't think most of them had been in the Soviet Union before 1939. And on top of that, you had the same pattern that we've seen in this war. Massive a number of civilian casualties, camps that Ukrainians were brought to, stories of looting, rape, same stuff that basically happened in a lot of other parts of the Soviet Union, and what has been happening today. And, Russian history in general, just briefly, from Pushkin, there's been a series of very unsavory elements that a lot of countries have in terms of their colonial history. United Kingdom as well, Britain definitely, France, Germany. So it's not something unique to Russia. And you know how it expanded? Well, basically incorporated a lot of the peoples around it, basically invaded and conquered and killed them, and then, you know, brought them into their polity. And that's something that they were doing there again. And that's something that we're seeing today in Ukraine. Russians are running up Russian flags along with Soviet flags, along with Soviet victory flags, when they claim that they've gone there to save the people of Donbass. No, if you're in Kherson and you're rolling up a Russian flag, it's just pure imperialism. So very similar. So you think there might be some reflection from Ellie, in light of the current war, as to what her grandfather was doing there.
After all, he returned from the war. He died in 2004. And I will always remember him as a hero, of course.
She will always remember as a hero. Really? Of course? And I think the of course part is a problem, right? I don't know if her grandfather committed war crimes. But does Ellie know if he committed war crimes or not? Has she ever dug a little bit deeper and see what was he doing? He was in the military for a long time, in a long time where Russia was an aggressive... See, I'm making the same Freudian slip. The Soviet Union was being an aggressive power, and it was invading its neighbors. 1940, it was not under attack. It was not a war of existential survival for the Soviet Union. It was aggressively expanding in an alliance with Nazi Germany, right? And then he, after fighting the Finns, probably, and the Nazis who did come to kill everybody, basically probably ultimately, or most people in the Soviet Union territories that they occupied. After the war, he's then sent to Western Ukraine, which is, you know, annexed by the Soviet Union, and he's there to crush the Ukrainians for 6.5 years. And this is a problem. I don't think it's just a problem Russia, as I said, it's a problem with all, I think, countries that were empires, the people don't question maybe some of the glory in what they were doing. The United Kingdom is also guilty of that. But if the country is an unreformed empire, which it seems that Russia under Putin is looking like, since they seem to think they have the right to behave like they did in the 19th and 20th centuries, just invade their neighbors, then not having any sort of reflection about who you're celebrating on May 9th, and maybe for other people, it's not a great day for them to celebrate, like they got annexed, they got murdered, they got genocided, like how many millions of Ukrainians were sent, when I said camps, they were sent to gulags for the simple reason that they were Ukrainians and they didn't want to be in the Soviet Union, they didn't want to be under primarily Russian authority, although the Soviet Union was obviously run by Stalin at the time. And Stalin, as I said, was a totalitarian regime. It's not like they liberated and then the people there got to decide what they wanted in some sort of liberal democracy or any sort of democracy, even just regional autonomy, really got to decide what they wanted. They were subjected to a totalitarian regime that killed more people over its time Stalin did than Hitler. He had a bit more time to go killing people. So another genocidal mania. And that's, for a lot of people, not a day of celebration. So there needs to be a little bit more self-reflection on that, I think. And whilst the Soviet Union was not the same murderous, genocidal state after Stalin's death in 1953, and his successor was actually Ukrainian, Khrushchev, still totalitarian. And a lot of people suffered under it for the next, well, how many? Almost 4 decades. And today, it's very disconcerting when you watch what's been happening in Ukraine. We see stories, allegations of mass rape, looting, prolific looting, and there's just so much evidence of that. War crimes, other war crimes, because they're also war crimes, arbitrary murder, detention, bombing of civilian areas, just so much destruction and death. Tens of thousands of people have died already, and we're only on day 98 of the war. We don't know for how long it's going to go on. And what's really disconcerting is several parts of the Russian media, the state media, openly talk about killing mass numbers of Ukrainians again. And we had the RIA Novosti articles where basically they don't use the word genocide, but it practically amounts to any Ukrainian who's going to resist Russification or basically Russian dominance needs to be taken care of, basically needs to be murdered, annihilated. Lots of stories of camps, sounds a bit similar to the Gulag, or re-education camps to persuade people that they're not really Ukrainian. And on statement, I'm going to play you a clip that's really scary. And remember, and this goes back to Ellie's being in the airport earlier. I'm showing this mask from Russia Today, right? Which is, I guess, ironic. I know this is supposed to be humor, because Russian state TV, you're obviously not allowed to criticize the war. You did have some military guy, I saw a clip where he basically said that things are not going well, and 2 days later he reappeared on television. He's a regular guest, and he suddenly said things are going well. So very rare to hear anything critical. And as according to that, basically, if you're saying things regularly, like RIA Novosti having this article, and you're going on primetime Russian television and you're saying things that are basically genocidal, and you get to say them, or that language gets to be used frequently, then someone in the Kremlin or some parts of Kremlin are sanctioning that. It is extremely disconcerting. I'm going to do another video about whether there's a genocide taking place, which is quite a tall bar, legally speaking. I have a background as a lawyer. So I'm going to play you this clip, and it is really, really scary. As if the war isn't scary enough already.
Потому что Азов это и есть фашистский СС, а ВСУ это вермахт. Ну это же очевидно так и происходит. Вот эти вот 2 миллиона человек должны были либо уехать с Украины, либо должны быть денацифицированы. То есть быть уничтожены.
Seriously, you have this lunatic, as far as I'm concerned, on Russian state TV. This is primetime television, and he's saying that basically the Azov battalion, or these more nationalistic parts, I guess he means, of the Ukrainian armed forces, are Nazis. That's a common trope in Russian propaganda, is that they're fighting the Nazis, that Azov is all Nazis. 2 million people need to be destroyed. He's talking about murdering 2 million people because they're against the idea of the Soviet Union and celebrating it, from what I can see. And basically what he's saying is these people are going to resist our domination. This genocidal lunatic wants to murder 2 million people. He's going to be in for a surprise if he comes to Ukraine, because it's not just 2 million people who oppose Russian domination. It's going to be tens of millions of people. What does he want to do with them? Well, our only conclusion, that he wants to also murder them as well. This is the kind of final solution stuff that was discussed at the Wannsee conference. This guy is calling the Azov Nazis when he's talking about murdering 2 million people on state TV. I mean, this is terrifying to watch. I think that this is what's been pumped into Russian households. And as I said, people in small towns, already discussed the Babushka Brigade, who just lap up, unquestionably, state propaganda in general. Kind of the older people it can also be in Ukraine to a certain extent. We had the Red Babushka, and Russia in particular. And then you have kind of the people who are opposed to the war, but in the last video, but don't really take that many chances or do anything to oppose the regime other than leaving. And now we have, celebration of May 9th. You have the people who watch this, who go out and celebrate May 9th. And I understand why they go and celebrate it, because celebrating their grandparents' generation and surviving, because the Nazis were, like this guy, genocidal, evil people. But there's no reflection about what's going on. What did the Soviet Union do, and how that connects to how Russia is behaving today. This, for me, is just, it's a portent of something even more terrifying and evil to come. And Russians need to do something about it. Otherwise, there are going to be celebrations in the future where people celebrate defeating this kind of Nazism, and it'll be Russia they will be celebrating defeating. So, yeah, do I want to watch the rest of this disgusting individual?
Столкнули в гражданскую войну народ с народом и жаждут, как бы тут это попилить Россию, сделать из нее 10, 15, 20 государств, чтобы вообще она никогда нам не создавала никаких проблем.
Из Украины тоже, между прочим. Пусть украинцы не тешат иллюзиями себя,
не получится у них ничего.
And there they go, just at the end, he goes into that it's the West is pushing Ukraine to be against. It's like Russia and Ukraine are one country. Like cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, right? Ukraine and Russia are two different countries. Yes, they have commonality together. I'm sitting in Ireland, Britain. Ireland obviously have shared history, a common language even, more than Ukrainians and Russians do these days. Religious commonality, probably a certain amount of DNA commonality at this stage, but we're two different people. And invading Ukraine in 2014 and 2022, annexing Crimea, starting the war in Donbass, and then this heinous war invasion since February 24th. You're seeing those cities leveled, like Mariupol, Volnovakha, Severodonetsk, and tens of thousands of people killed. That's the reason why Ukraine's even more than want to be with you, and it's going to be tens of millions that are going to resist. And he's talking about how the West is plotting to partition Russia. If Russia doesn't change course, it's a risk in the long term of ending up partitioning itself. So it's up to Russians. Today, I implore them to stop this madness. Don't be sucked in by the nostalgia of greatness of the past and thinking that it translates into committing genocide today in Ukraine. Slava Україні! Героям слава! До побачення! До свидання! Слава.
Tsar Experience.